Hey there, Reconciled Church. Pastor Kevin here with like a special edition or whatever you would call this. So basically, just to give a little bit of context, if you were here on this past Sunday, you know we looked at Colossians chapter 3 and we looked at the various roles in the household that Paul addresses there. And one of the things that came to my mind and I wanted to address on is the fact that of the roles we looked at, so we looked at husbands and wives, we looked at children and parents, we looked at slaves and masters, the idea of a single person never came up. And this isn't really just explained. This isn't because, oh my gosh, I didn't want to talk about single people. It's that we're teaching Colossians, and he doesn't. Those aren't one of the. That isn't one of the categories he gives there. It's not one of the specific groups or roles he looks at. And so, however, I do think it's important. And so I wanted to make sure we kind of touched on that a little bit. So I thought I would do this special from the cutting room floor video on singleness. Cool? So anyways, the question is then, maybe why didn't Paul address that in Colossians chapter 3? Why, if he's addressing all these things ranging from like husbands to slaves, he didn't think to throw in like single dudes in there, single ladies in there at any point? A couple thoughts on why that might be. Paul's discussion in Colossians specifically is looking at relationships in the household and specifically looking at those things in relationship to the other. Like I said, none of these things are looked at in isolation. So it's not like he's just saying this is what it means to be a husband and makes no reference to wife. This is what it means to be a parent and makes no reference to children. All the things we see in Colossians 3 are looked at in connection with one another. And so that doesn't necessarily, singleness just doesn't really fit that theme. And so that might be one reason why he left that out. When we talk about these ideas, now I guess there's some sense where you could be, some of these parties would definitely be single. Children would definitely be single. You could be either a slave or a master in this context and not necessarily be married. So there's some of that. But what we also find here is specifically there is a hierarchy in those relationships. So there's a clear head and there's a clear person who's called to submit to the authority of that head. We saw that with husbands and wives. We see that with parents and children, and we see that with slaves and masters. So the fact that singleness just doesn't really fit in with that might be some reason for that. Also, frankly, Paul just doesn't talk about it there. He talks about it plenty of other places, some of which I'm going to look at this morning with you guys. But it's just important to say that it's a letter written to a specific people group. There's a reason for which he wrote it, and at that point in time, Paul didn't see it as pertinent to include that in his letter. Now, the good news is the Bible talks a lot about singleness, and so I hope to show a little bit about that with you guys today, and specifically some of that stuff that Paul himself talks about. Paul himself was a single guy, so it's not like he was unaware of these things. Paul wasn't the guy who just never had taken into account that there were some people that didn't marry, didn't have kids, things like that. So there's some things I want to look at with this. Same idea as yesterday when we were looking at Colossians which I realized when I put this out, it won't have been yesterday. That was Sunday, so just ignore that. It's all good. We're good with that. One of the things that Paul sets out there is he's laying a framework. Okay, so he doesn't exhaust what it means to be a biblical husband in Colossians. He doesn't exhaust what it means to be a biblical wife, a godly parent or child or anything like that. Same thing's going to be kind of true of our discussion on singleness today. I'm going to give you some ideas and some things, but obviously this doesn't exhaust these things. There's more. The Bible has more to say about it. I'm sure we'll get around to it eventually. And if you're more curious, look in your Bible. Research these things. Don't take my word for it. Look at the scriptures. So some questions that come to mind that I want to do this. What I want to do for this discussion is kind of couch it in 3 questions and show the biblical answer, I believe, in response to those questions. And I think that'll help kind of shape an understanding of Christian singleness. Okay? So with that said, First question I have is it God's plan that everyone would marry? So, one of the things that's often the case in churches is uh, it's very easy, because churches tend to be made up of a lot of families, to almost not pay as much attention to singles, or simply to view it as, well, it's like a temporary thing. They're single until they're married, and so, we just don't bother with it that much. This, I don't believe, is really in keeping with the biblical idea of singleness. So let me give you a specific passage. Okay, short answer to that question. Is it God's plan that everyone should marry? No. Here's why I think so. A helpful passage in this is Matthew chapter 19. In Matthew chapter 19, basically, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they try to trap him. And they try to trap him on issues of divorce. It doesn't go well for him. It never goes well for the Pharisees when they try to trap Jesus. Basically what happens is, this is what this is how Jesus raises the question with him. Verse 6, chapter 19, he says, "What therefore God has joined together, let man not separate." Therefore, this is a way of him saying, if you've been married, don't divorce. They then ask him a question of, well, why then did Moses tell people to give a husband divorcing his wife to give her a certificate of divorce? Why did he do this? And he says, verse 8, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. So, in other words, the divorce certificate was given because of sin. It was a response to sin, and as a way to kind of protect against the harmful effects of sin. The Bible teaches that men and women are meant to marry and stay married so long as they both shall live. And so, Moses, to explain the kind of context in this day, in that day and age especially, a husband would abandon his wife, and as a result, without like a certificate of divorce showing that she was actually single again, this could leave many women destitute, because they would still be, no one would talk to them, no one would approach them, because they view them as a married woman. And so if a woman wanted to remarry, even if her husband left her, she couldn't, because the idea was, well, she's still married. Understand, this is a time when women had a lot less opportunities to work and such, and so a woman's options would have been very limited, and so rendering her unable to remarry was a significant thing. You could curse a person to poverty with that, which is terrible. And so what Jesus is saying is, Moses gave you that law because you're sinful, because he knew some people were just going to abandon their wives, and he says, well, if you're going to abandon your wife, at least give her a certificate of divorce. That's not the way it was supposed to be. That's not what you were created for. However, this is a way of, like I said, protecting people in those instances. Anyways, so after hearing this idea that, look, this isn't what you were made to. You were made to stay married your whole life. The disciples remark in verse 10, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. So that's what apparently these guys were just not looking to get, most of these guys were not looking to get married. Peter was married. I don't know about the other ones. Obviously, Paul was single. We know that. And so that's the remark. Well, if you cannot divorce, maybe it's better just not to marry in the first place. Now, Jesus doesn't quite give them a straightforward yes or no on this question. So it's not that he just goes, hey, you're right, it's as you said it is, or no, that's not how it works. Rather, this is how he responds. Verse 11, he says, not everyone can receive this saying. What saying? The saying that it is better not to marry. But only those to whom it has been given. Verse 12, for there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it. So, in other words, if you can accept this, and not just like accept this truth, but actually live by this truth that it's better not to be married, then do so. Jesus says. He says you've been given something special. You've been given an ability that not everyone has, and if you can accept it, accept it. There's three situations here. that specifically Jesus points out. Now, he takes the very extreme. He refers to people, he refers to eunuchs here. Now, the Bible is not teaching that you should be a eunuch, okay? The Bible, however, is taking, this is similar to what we saw yesterday with slaves and masters. The Bible is taking the most extreme version of that, and it's saying, this is what you do. So the idea is a eunuch was the most extreme version of singleness. They didn't just choose not to have a wife. They went to far greater means to ensure their singleness on this. But Jesus basically says there's three kinds of eunuchs here. He says there's those who are born this way, there's those who are made this way by men, and then there's those who chose to be this way. Now, apply this to our current situation with singleness. What we would say is that we could say that there's two types of single people. There are people who choose to be single, and there are people who are unwillingly single. Both are the case. And some people, some people have been gifted to some extent. They don't have the same desires that others have. Some might have those desires, but not the opportunity to marry. Those are both situations that we might encounter. But whatever the situation, Jesus says that if someone is able to receive the teaching, it's better for them to remain single. He should accept it. Not only he should accept it, he should rejoice in it. So we want to understand that. We want to make sure that we understand that singleness is not this thing that we just treat as like weird or an abnormality. Jesus gives a lot of glory to it. He says, like, this is a good thing. If you can handle it, that's awesome. Go with it. Like, you know what I mean? So Jesus isn't viewing married people here and single people as less of people here, and so neither should God's people in the church. So that's the idea. Second question. I'm single. I'm not single. I'm married. Been married for almost 13 years now and have 3 kids. But let's say you say, I am single. Is it wrong for me to desire to be married? So if Jesus said it's better to be single, or it's better not to marry if you can accept it, is it wrong? Is it sin for me if I actually want to have a wife? Once again, no. So to help explain this passage, I want to go to another passage. This is from Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, let's back up a little bit. Let's give a little context to the situation in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul addresses a really big issue. Basically, there are people, not only non-believers, there are Christians who are going to see prostitutes, okay? And so he addresses this issue. He says, basically, like, this practice would have been common in the pagan world, but it has no part in the Christian life. So he writes in chapter 6, verse 15, Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is written, the two will become one flesh. So, the people there didn't realize the serious ramifications of what they were doing, their actions. It's not merely a physical act, Paul's saying. It's a joining together of two parties. They are becoming one, so to speak. And so, on the basis of that danger, because they might have been thinking, because like I said, this could have been a common practice. If you came from a background where that was a common practice, now you're a believer and you think, well, you know, maybe this is a wise decision to make. Some people could even construe this as, well, this allows me to deal with certain desires and urges, so I don't have to get married, because I don't want to be bogged down with marriage. I want to be devoted to some extent, so I'm just going to go see a prostitute sometimes, and that'll handle that. That'll handle that. It sounds crazy, but this is probably what more than a few people thought. Now, it's on the basis of that Paul writes in verse 18 of chapter 6 to flee from sexual immorality. Basically, you guys don't understand what you're getting into. You don't understand the ramifications and the long-term effects it's going to have on you. Don't do it. Run from that. Now, with that said, in chapter 7, Paul moves on to the discussion of marriage. He's answering a question that he had already that the Corinthians had already written to him about. Verse 1 of chapter 7, it says, Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, Each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband, okay? Paul himself is a single guy. He seems to be affirming something similar to what we find in Jesus' words, that if you're able to, it's a good thing if you can remain single. However, he fleshes this idea out further. Basically, it would be better to take a wife for a person rather than to be led into sexual immorality. So if you're given if you're given two options there, you're saying, I struggle a lot with lust and sexual desires, and I can either simply go, deal with that outside of the boundaries of marriage, or go get married, which is entering in a covenant with another person. Paul says, do the latter. Go get married. It's better for you to do that. It's better for each person to have their own wife, and for each wife to have her own husband, rather than to be just kind of going around, sleeping around, so to speak. However, if someone can keep from sexual immorality, obviously that's a good thing. If you can keep from sexual immorality and you want to remain single, that's a good thing. One of the things I think we find in our culture right now is there's a lot of people who want to remain single, but cannot, but have strong desires that lead them into sexual immorality. I think this is why you see a lot of promiscuity and stuff in our culture, not only in outside of churches, but also even in Christian churches. It's because they've bought into this myth that it's better off for them simply to be unmarried. Now, a lot of people see marriage as something that ties you down. It's something that simply holds you back in life. Now, it doesn't make things easier, and I'll show you that in a minute, but it's important to understand that what we see right now in our culture is a lot of people who aren't willing to make the commitment of marriage and but still want the blessings of marriage. They still want a healthy sexual relationship, okay? And so they're sort of living this this thing where it's not really singleness, it's living like you were married it's taking advantage of the blessings of marriage without the commitment of marriage, which is not real singleness. It's certainly not it's not biblical singleness. So then Paul goes on to state in verse 6 of chapter 7, he says, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each one has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another." So what he's saying here is, look, personally, I wish everyone was able to just to be single, and he's going to explain why that is. It's not just because he's like, I don't want to see anyone get married, or Paul hated babies or anything like that. That's not the case. But basically, what he's saying is, when he says this is a concession, not a command. Now, we can kind of take this two ways, and we can take this too far in different ways. Some people would say, well, this is Paul just expressing his opinion. Like if he was like, hey, some people like their coffee black, I like mine with cream and sugar. He's just saying that. That's not the case. Paul has the Spirit of God, as he tells us here. So this is part of Scripture. This is divinely offered. So we can't just simply shrug this off as being a preferential thing. However, what Paul's saying here is it's not a command, in the sense it's not a clear sense of right and wrong. The person who gets married is not in sin. The person who stays single is not in sin. Now, there's a sense where married people sin, single people sin, but it's not to say that is always necessarily the case, or it's not the case. It's not always the case specifically about their marriage or their singleness. Okay, so this is important because, like I said, churches do a bad job of doing this. We often will. If you can think of kind of two ends of the spectrum, actually. So you can think of those who have put marriage on a pedestal and simply said that this is the only way to live. This is the only God-glorying way to live, is to get married and make babies. You can also see on the other end of the spectrum with other. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily is prominent in the Christian church, though you might find it there. You might find Christians there. You'll find people who will hold up singleness too high, basically, and say, "Oh my gosh, if you want to be a leader in the church, if you want to be a real man of God, you will take a vow of celibacy." We've found both of those throughout church history. Both of those, I think, are false, and they neglect the importance of the other. Paul says it this way: each one has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So singleness is a gift from God, and marriage is a gift from God. The ability specifically to not struggle with a lot of sexual temptation and stuff that most people tend to struggle with is an absolute blessing from God. And given the same token, if God gives you a good, godly wife, praise God, that's a blessing as well. So, it's like I said, single people aren't to be viewed as second-rate citizens. They should view their singleness as a form of blessing from God. It's a gift, so to speak. And then he talks about this idea he goes on in verse 32. He says, I want you to be free from anxieties. So, Paul, why are you saying this stuff? Why are you telling this? He says, verse 32, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Okay? So Paul's goal there is, as much as possible, I don't want to put something that would be a hindrance in your way. I want you to live undivided in your devotion to the Lord. He wants a single-minded commitment to Christ. Now, it's important to understand here that that's what God requires. God requires complete devotion of the individual. If you're married, it doesn't mean that you're off the hook. It doesn't mean that you can say, well, I can be as divided as I want because I'm married. Elsewhere in this chapter, Paul says, let him who has a wife act as though he didn't. What does he mean? He's not saying abandon your wife. What he's saying is you should have a complete and utter devotion to the Lord the same way as if you did not have any other commitments in your life, the same way as if you were not married. And so that's the idea there. Also, it's just a truth. He's 100% accurate here. I don't know any married person who would deny this. He says he's doing this to free us from anxieties. I don't know any married person who wouldn't tell you that being married is at times a more stressful way of life. It just is. You have to care for each other. I'm not just responsible now for myself. I'm responsible for my wife. I'm responsible for my kids. I'm responsible for caring for all of them. And the same thing is true of Shannon. So there is there is more anxiety comes with it. This is like more, how do we put it? More responsibilities, more problems. Okay, guys? More commitments, more problems. That's my Biggie Smalls reference for this week. But anyways, so that's the idea that Paul is getting at there. Is basically, I don't want to put anything in your life that's going to hold you back from being all that God wants you to be, from being completely devoted to the Lord. That said, if you are married, you're not somehow exempt from being completely devoted to the Lord. You have to be completely devoted to the Lord and devoted to your spouse as well. Make sense? All right. So with that said, that's part of the benefits of singleness. That's one of the things that make it better. It allows you to serve the Lord without certain constraints that married people have, which is a good thing. It's something to be rejoiced in, okay? Like, there's, in essence, you shouldn't view this as simply, like I said, you should not view your singleness as something that is just a holdup you shouldn't see it as something that like means you're basically in like purgatory until God lets you into his real plans for your life, which is marriage. Quite the opposite. You should view it this way, as seeing that God has blessed you with an opportunity to be devoted to him in a way without distractions and anxieties that married people would have. and make the most of it, I believe. So, what should we do? Okay, so there's a couple different situations and scenarios I can imagine here. I can imagine that there are people who are single and have always felt somehow left out in certain circumstances, especially in churches, because they've always been single. That's wrong, and as a pastor, let me apologize if I've ever done anything remotely like that to you. We should not be doing that. We should appreciate the fact that both marriage and singleness are part of God's plans for different people in life. Okay. There's also probably people who are single now who are going to get married. As a matter of fact, statistically speaking, most people are going to be that. Okay, so most people get married, and so a lot of people are temporarily single now, but will eventually not be. Some of them may not be 100% set in stone whether they actually want to remain single or get married, and some of them are like, if I can get married, I'm going to get married. Okay, and still, there could also be someone who is single but not by choice, that wants and desires to be married but has been unsuccessful and just unable to find a spouse at this point in time, which is going to happen. And I don't want to pretend for a second that that's not a possibility. Some of the things we think about in life are these like overly romanticized ideas, like it's serendipity or something. And, God's just going to make the one come down out of the sky and just like, hey, this is the person you're supposed to marry. I don't know that it's always, I don't think it's always that clear cut. So what do you do right now? What are some takeaways? I've got 3 takeaways for you guys for this. What should you do if you're single? First, understand your personal desires. Something that goes to the heart of what Paul's talking about here is Paul puts a lot of weight on the idea of our own personal desires. Do you desire a marriage? Or, some people be like, I don't want to be married, but they think about like, oh, well, but I have sexual desires. Well, guess what? Sexual desires are desires that only find their fulfillment in a marriage. So if you find yourself often struggling with lust and things like that, it's a good chance that you really want to be married, but have a displaced version of what have like a displaced idea of how to fulfill that desire. Okay, so basically, if you have a desire to get married, or even desires that are pulling you into sexually immoral temptations, then you should probably look to get married. Now, I understand that's not as easy as we might think. You got to find someone. If I could speak a little bit from my own experience as well, I'll be honest, guys. I was a person who I wasn't 100% sure as a young adult if I was going to get married, and it wasn't like I was just, oh my gosh, like I just struggled with lust all the time, and so I guess I gotta get married. That wasn't how it worked for me. I realized I had a desire to get married when I met the woman who would become my wife. So it was I was a little bit up in the air before that. I mean, I had crushes in my life and stuff. I don't think that's necessarily just because you've had a crush at one point in life. I don't think that rules out the possibility that maybe God has called you to singleness. But when I got to know Shannon, and specifically what I got to know about her was her devotion to the Lord, I was like, this is the girl. I want to marry this girl. And so that changed everything. So understand this isn't, you have to be able to gauge your personal desires. You've got to kind of know where your heart's at to some extent. You've got to be able to say, I want this thing, or you know what, this isn't an important thing to me. And there are plenty of people like that. And, or maybe you might say to yourself, I mean, there's something that sounds nice about being married, but something sounds nice about being single, and you come to the decision that you would rather be single for the sake of your devotion to God rather than be married. That's totally fine. That is your decision to make, so long as it's not leading you into sin. Suppose you say, I have enough self-control, I can I'm going to stay away from, abstain from sexual immorality and stuff. That's totally great. Basically, know the desires of your heart, and so that you are able to glorify God, both with your potential marriage, if you're someone who is single now but hopes to get married, or your singleness, if you're just saying, this is for me. So that's the first idea. Second, make your faith your top priority, okay? God doesn't get a piece of your life. He gets the whole thing. When you make following Christ your chief concern, the other stuff kind of all falls under all the other stuff falls underneath it, and a lot of those worries and concerns kind of just work themselves out. So if you're someone who's looking for a spouse, so if your faith is first understand your faith is your top priority. So my top priority is to glorify God. But let's say I also have a desire to find a spouse. I want to find a significant other. Well, understand something. Your top priority then in picking a spouse should be faith, okay? It's worth noting that when God brought Eve to Adam, she is described as a helper for him. You want to look for someone in a spouse who will help you, where you can help one another mature in faith, okay? You should strengthen one another's faith rather than being weakened by it, okay? Now, if you're going to look for a potential spouse, look for someone who makes each of your faith better by being together, which implies they should be another believer, okay? So, guys, stop trying to kid yourself. If you're like, I think this person's cute and they're nice and stuff, they're not really a Christian, but they're nice and they could be, like, that's, no. That's not wisdom. That's not biblical wisdom. Stop kidding yourself. You're making excuses to do what your own sinful heart wants to do. Let's just call it for what it is. Your faith is a non-negotiable. And if you want to help yourself attain the kind of relationship where you're living by faith, your faith is your top priority, and your marriage commitment is like a second priority, you got to look for someone who shares your faith. Simple as that. If you're married to someone who's a non-believer, that doesn't mean you leave them or something like that, but it does say that if you're single and you're able to make those kinds of decisions, you should consider these things in making those decisions. Third idea. Whatever situation you find yourself in, honor the Lord. Truth is, there are some people who may be single but don't desire to be, who are still going to be single. This is just the truth. I think this is honestly is probably maybe more prominent in our day and age, though I could be wrong. I'm not looking at all the stats or anything. If you're single, take that as a blessing from God rather than a curse. God has blessed you with an opportunity to follow him with undivided interests. Whether your time in singleness is permanent or temporary, trust that God has a purpose with it and make it your aim to honor him with your life. Okay? Paul says this to the Corinthian church in chapter 7, verse 17. He says, "Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches." So remember, he said, look, this is my concession. It's not a command. He says this is a command. This is a rule. Whatever God's called you to, honor him with it. You know what I mean? If the life which God has assigned you to, accept it and appreciate it. It might be a temporary situation or it might be a permanent situation, but it doesn't matter. Ultimately, the relationship which lasts forever is our unity to Christ. And so make that your top priority. Guys, I have ran too long probably already. It's like a second sermon. I hope if you stuck around this far, I hope it was helpful. If you have more questions, you can email me. And I will see you soon.